I remember the day my own daughter-in-law looked at me with sharp eyes and said she didn't want this useless old woman in her house anymore. And my son, the boy I carried through hunger and sleepless nights, sat in silence before nodding in agreement. In that moment, my heart broke in ways I never thought possible. But what they didn't know was that the very next morning, a knock at their door would change everything. Thank you for watching and giving me a moment of your time. It truly means more than I can say. And before I go further, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please share it in the comments, because I always enjoy seeing how far these words travel and how many hearts they reach. You see, when I heard those cruel words in my own home, it felt like the walls themselves had closed in on me. And even though I stood there holding back tears, I reminded myself that silence is sometimes stronger than shouting, and that dignity is the only shield left when love turns its back. I was not always this tired woman they saw as a burden. I had a life filled with sacrifice and endless work, just to make sure my son would grow into a man who would never have to go through the same hunger and struggles I once faced. I scrubbed floors until my hands cracked. I cooked meals from scraps when there was hardly anything in the pantry. And I sat awake at night sewing and mending so he would never go to school in clothes that made him feel less than the others. I remember when he was small and his shoes wore thin. I walked miles in my old worn slippers so he could have the better pair. And when illness came to my body, I fought silently through it, never telling him how much pain I carried, because my greatest joy was in seeing him smile and succeed. Over the years, I gave everything. Not for riches or praise, but because love for him was enough. And when he married, I told myself it was a blessing. That maybe at last I could rest a little and feel warmth in a fuller family. His wife was never cruel in the beginning. She kept her distance, but she let me cook, she let me clean. And I thought maybe in time she would accept me as part of the home. But I noticed small looks, little sighs when I moved too slowly, words whispered under her breath when she thought I could not hear. Still, I pushed those feelings aside, telling myself she was young and perhaps stressed with the thought of starting her own family. And I clung to the hope that one day she would see me, not as an inconvenience, but as the woman who had given her husband the very life she now shared. My heart carried those hopes quietly, even as the cracks began to show, because I could not imagine that after everything, my son would ever let me fall. But everything began to shift the moment she became pregnant. It was as if overnight I had turned from someone who was useful in the home to someone who carried nothing but weight on their shoulders. At first it came in small ways. Little sighs when I asked if she needed help. Rolling of eyes when I brought her food, whispers into the phone that stopped the moment I entered the room. I told myself it was the stress of carrying life, that her moods were fragile and her patience was thin, so I stayed quieter. I made myself smaller. I moved about the house like a shadow, cleaning without sound, cooking without asking, folding their laundry and tucking it away as if I were invisible. Yet no matter how silent I became, no matter how much I tried to disappear, her dislike for me grew louder. It grew sharper, and it spread like smoke through the rooms until I could hardly breathe in my own corner of the house. I remember one morning when I placed a plate of breakfast on the table. She pushed it aside without touching it, muttering that she couldn't stand the smell. And though I tried to hide my hurt, I felt my hands shake as I carried the dish back to the kitchen. Another evening, I overheard her telling a friend that she couldn't wait to have the house to herself. That once the baby came, she didn't want me around stressing her with my old ways and outdated habits. I stood in the hallway listening, feeling my chest tighten, asking myself how I had become this person she described. Because all I had done was give love in the only ways I knew how. My son, my own flesh and blood, noticed the tension but chose silence. And that silence became its own kind of cruelty. Because when a man refuses to speak for his mother, he is speaking still, only with a voice that says she is not worth defending. I would watch him sit in his chair while she made her remarks. His head lowered, his lips pressed tight, never once raising his eyes to mine, as though if he looked, he would see the betrayal written across his own face. The weight of it grew each day, heavier than any chore I had ever carried, heavier than years of working 2 jobs to keep him fed, heavier than nights of swallowing tears so he would not hear me cry. And then came the afternoon, when all the unspoken things turned into words that cut sharper than any knife. She stood in the living room, her voice loud, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, and she said she didn't want this useless old woman here while she was pregnant. My knees weakened, my breath caught in my chest, and I turned to my son, waiting, praying, begging silently for him to rise up and remind her who I was, but he did not. He looked at me, then at her, and after a moment that seemed to stretch like an endless rope, he simply nodded and said, "Maybe I should find a new place to live." I cannot describe the silence that followed. It was not the silence of peace or calm. It was the silence of a heart shattering, the silence of trust breaking into 1,000 sharp pieces. I felt the years of sacrifice flash before my eyes. Every meal cooked, every sickness endured, every time I gave when I had nothing, and I realized none of it mattered to them anymore. They wanted me gone. They wanted my absence more than they valued my presence. I stood there trembling, holding my tears back, not for them but for myself, because I knew if I let them see my pain, they would believe their cruelty had won. So I gathered what strength I had left, nodded slowly, and walked back to my room. Each step echoing with memories of a lifetime given freely, and a love now discarded like an old coat left to rot in the rain. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a long moment, my chest heavy, my eyes burning, but I refused to let the tears fall just yet, because I wanted to hold on to a little dignity, even as the walls seemed to press down on me. I looked around at the room that had been mine, the bed where I had spent sleepless nights thinking of ways to make their lives easier, the small dresser that held the few things I still treasured, and suddenly everything felt foreign, as if I was already a stranger in a house I had once called home. My hands trembled as I reached for the old suitcase I had kept tucked away in the corner, and as I placed it on the bed, the sound of the metal clasps snapping open felt louder than thunder in my ears. I began folding my clothes slowly, carefully, not because I had many things, but because each piece carried a memory. A story of a life built on sacrifice. There was the faded dress I wore to his graduation, the scarf I knitted on long winter nights when my fingers ached from cold, the sweater that had been patched so many times it no longer looked new, but I kept it because it reminded me of years when I went without so he could have more. As I laid each piece into the suitcase, I thought of the meals I had cooked, the nights I had stayed awake, listening for the sound of his key in the door when he was young and reckless, the way I prayed for him in silence every morning. None of it seemed to matter now. Not to him. Not to the woman carrying his child. And that realization cut me deeper than her words ever could. I paused at the edge of the bed, clutching the old photograph of us when he was small, his smile wide, his arms wrapped around my neck, a reminder of a time when I was his whole world, when he believed I was the one person who would never let him down. I whispered to that photograph, as if he could still hear the boy he once was, asking him why the man he had become had forgotten. My tears finally fell then, quiet and hot, dripping onto the glass as I pressed the frame against my chest. But I quickly wiped my face because I would not let despair swallow me whole. With each item I placed in the suitcase, I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. But I also felt something else rising within me. Something small but steady, a whisper reminding me that I was not as powerless as they believed. I closed the suitcase at last, straightened my back, and looked around the room one final time. The air was thick with sorrow, yet beneath it lay a hidden truth I carried close to my heart, a truth that would reveal itself soon enough, though they could not imagine it yet. And as I lifted that suitcase, my body aching but my spirit unbroken, I walked out of that room, knowing that, while they had pushed me aside, they had also awakened a strength they had long forgotten I still possessed. I carried the suitcase down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the weight of the bag itself, because it was not just clothes I was taking with me. It was the years I had given, the laughter and the tears, the quiet moments that had once made this place feel like a home. I walked past the living room where only hours earlier I had been told I was useless, and though I wanted to turn and look at my son one last time, I kept my eyes forward because I knew if I allowed myself even a single glance, I would crumble, and I could not let them see me broken. The door felt colder than usual as my hand reached for the knob, and when I opened it, the air outside rushed in sharp and biting, as if the world itself knew I was stepping into a different chapter of my life. I did not say goodbye, not because I lacked words, but because no words could hold the weight of what had been done to me. And in truth, I did not owe them the courtesy of a farewell. I walked slowly down the path, the same path I had once swept clean, the same path I had watched him run down as a boy with scraped knees and a smile too wide for his face. And now that path felt longer than it ever had before, stretching out like a reminder of how far I had come, only to be cast aside. The street was quiet, no neighbors watching, no voices calling out, just me and the steady sound of my own footsteps. And with each step I felt the ache of betrayal, but also the faint stirring of something deeper, a strength born out of pain. When I reached the small place I had arranged for myself, I set the suitcase down and let out a breath I had been holding since the moment they told me to leave. The room was modest, the walls bare, the furniture simple, yet it carried something the other house no longer did. It carried peace, because here I could exist without someone reminding me I was in the way. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands over the fabric of the blanket, and for the first time in days, I allowed my shoulders to relax. It hurt to think I had been forced out, but deep inside me I also knew I had not been left with nothing. For I still held a piece of power they could not see, a truth tied to the very roof over their heads. They believed they had pushed me aside for good, but they had no idea the home they sat in that night, with laughter and smug relief, was never truly theirs. Because while they thought I was weak, I had long ago chosen to protect myself in ways they never considered. And though I sat alone in that quiet room, I whispered to myself that tomorrow would come. And when it did, their world would begin to shift in ways they never imagined. That night, as I sat in that quiet little room, the air still heavy with the sting of rejection, I could not stop my mind from wandering back to the years when I first made the decision to secure the deed to the house. I had done it not out of selfishness, but out of fear. Fear that one day I might be left with nothing after giving everything. Fear that the sacrifices of a lifetime could be erased in a moment of carelessness or greed. I remember walking into that lawyer's office all those years ago, my hands trembling as I signed the papers, my heart whispering that it was better to prepare for storms even when the skies were still clear. It was a quiet choice, a secret I carried alone, and though I prayed I would never need to use it, a part of me always knew that life has a cruel way of testing the strong. As I thought of it that night, I felt both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that the ones I loved had pushed me to the very edge, and relief that I had listened to that inner voice that told me to hold on to something of my own. They believed the house was theirs. They decorated the rooms, they spoke of it as if it belonged only to them, yet all the while, I remained the one who held the true power over those walls. I sat there in the dim light, clutching the papers I had kept safe for so long, running my fingers along the edges, feeling the strength they carried, not because of money or property, but because they represented the dignity I had fought never to lose. I could almost see their faces when the truth would finally surface. The daughter-in-law with her sharp tongue suddenly silenced, my son with his lowered eyes forced at last to lift them and see what he had thrown away. That thought did not bring me joy in the way revenge might, but it brought me a kind of steadiness, a reminder that even in my loneliness I was not powerless. They thought I had walked away broken, but in truth I had walked away carrying a key they did not even know existed, a key that could change everything overnight. As I placed the papers back into their envelope and slid them carefully into the drawer beside my bed, I whispered to myself that the next day would not belong to them. It would belong to the truth, and that truth would knock on their door louder than any voice they had used to throw me aside. That next morning, as I sat by the small window of my new place, the sun creeping gently over the rooftops, I thought of them sitting in that house believing they had finally rid themselves of me. believing they had claimed some kind of victory. I could almost picture her walking through the rooms with a smile of triumph, speaking proudly of how peaceful it felt now that I was gone, while my son sat beside her, pretending not to hear the poison in her words, but secretly agreeing with every one of them. They thought they had silenced me, pushed me into nothingness, but what they did not know was that silence has a way of turning into the loudest sound when the right moment comes. I imagined them laughing as they planned for the baby, feeling safe under a roof they never owned, and I could almost hear her telling him how good it was to finally live without an old woman in the way. What she did not know was that her comfort was built on a lie. A lie that would soon crumble the moment reality walked through the door. And so, while they celebrated in ignorance, I held the quiet knowledge that the house they so proudly claimed was already slipping from their grasp, and the knock that was coming would change their smiles into questions and their arrogance into fear. As I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart steady, despite the ache of betrayal, I reminded myself that life has a way of exposing truth when pride grows too large. They had looked at me and seen weakness, but what they failed to see was the years of foresight and strength that had kept me standing, even when everything tried to pull me down. That morning I did not rush, I did not pace, I simply waited with patience, because I knew that in their home, where they thought they had finally won, the sound of a firm knock would soon remind them that nothing built on cruelty ever lasts. And just as I had imagined, the morning did not pass quietly in their house, because soon enough a knock came at their door, sharp and steady, the kind of knock that makes your chest tighten before you even open it. I was not there to see it with my own eyes, but I knew the way it must have sounded, echoing through the very walls they thought belonged to them. She would have frowned, irritated that someone dared disturb her comfort so early, and my son would have dragged himself to the door, unprepared for what waited on the other side. When that door opened, they would not have been met with a neighbor or a friendly face, but with the firm presence of the new landlord holding papers in his hand, papers that carried my name, papers that told the truth they had refused to see. I could almost hear her voice rising, sharp and indignant, demanding to know what he meant when he spoke of rent, of agreements, of ownership that did not belong to them. I could see my son's face fall, confusion turning to disbelief as he glanced back at her, searching for answers that did not exist. In that moment, the pride they had carried so loudly must have cracked, because no matter how they argued, the truth was written in black and white, undeniable and cold. The home they had laughed in, the home where they cast me aside, no longer answered to them, and the knock they heard that morning was the sound of their arrogance meeting reality. As I sat miles away in my little room, I felt a strange calmness settle over me. Not joy, not revenge, but a quiet confirmation that what is hidden in the dark will always come to light. They had believed my silence was weakness, but in truth, my silence had been preparation. And when that knock came, it carried the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every insult I had swallowed, and every tear I had refused to shed in front of them. That morning belonged not to their triumph, but to truth itself, and truth always has a way of finding the door. I can only imagine how the air inside that house must have shifted when the words were finally spoken, when the landlord calmly explained that their stay there depended not on ownership, but on agreements they had never signed, and that the woman they had cast out held the strings they thought they controlled. She would have shouted, her voice rising with panic, trying to insist there had been a mistake, her face red with anger as she demanded answers she did not want to hear. My son, the one who had once trusted me with every decision, must have stood frozen, torn between disbelief and shame, knowing deep inside that he had chosen the wrong side, that he had allowed the woman he married to poison the very bond that once held us together. Their arrogance must have melted into desperation as they begged for time, as they argued with words that sounded empty even to their own ears. She would have tried to act strong, insisting the house was theirs, insisting they would not leave, but every piece of paper in that landlord's hand carried a truth that could not be undone by her shouting. My son may have lowered his head then, the same way he used to when he was caught in a lie as a child, unable to look anyone in the eye, because deep down he knew the weight of what he had done. I picture him glancing around the room, seeing the walls, the furniture, the life he thought was his, and realizing all of it had stood on ground he never truly owned. And while they scrambled for explanations, while they felt the floor tilt beneath their pride, I sat quietly in my modest place, feeling no rush of victory, only a steady calmness that told me everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. I had not shouted, I had not cursed, I had not fought them with fire. Yet the truth had spoken for me in a way far louder than my voice ever could. They had thought I was powerless, but in that moment they saw the power of foresight, the strength of silence, and the cost of cruelty. And I believe that as the landlord's words sank into their hearts, they finally understood that dismissing me so easily had not freed them. It had only trapped them in a cage built by their own betrayal. I know that after the truth was laid before them, the walls of that house no longer felt like protection. They must have felt like prison bars, closing in tighter with every passing moment. Because nothing weighs heavier than realizing the roof above your head rests on someone else's mercy. Especially the mercy of the woman you cast aside, as if she meant nothing. She would have paced the floor, her voice sharp and shrill, demanding that my son do something, anything, to fix the situation. But what could he say? What could he offer, when the very foundation of their comfort had been built on lies and entitlement? I imagine him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his words fumbling as he tried to defend a position he no longer held. And I wonder if in that silence between their arguments he finally heard the echo of his own betrayal. The pride that had made her so bold before must have turned to fear. The smugness in her voice replaced by panic, as she realized that the house she had claimed as her sanctuary now belonged to someone who would not bend to her cruelty. And my son, though he may not have admitted it aloud, must have felt the sting of regret burning through him. The image of me leaving with my suitcase flashing in his mind, the sound of my footsteps fading while he sat in silence, choosing her words over my years of sacrifice. That image would haunt him, because once a man sees the cost of his silence, it never leaves him. It lingers in the corners of every room. It sits heavy in the quiet moments when there is nothing left to say. As for me, I did not need to witness their unraveling. I did not need to stand at the door to see the panic in their faces, because I carried in my heart the certainty that what you sow will always return. And what they had sown was disrespect, unkindness, and arrogance. I carried my pain with dignity, and in return, life carried my justice to their doorstep without me lifting a hand. And so while they argued and trembled, I sat in the stillness of my new space, breathing freely, knowing that sometimes the sweetest strength is not in shouting or striking back, but in letting truth speak louder than you ever could. In the days that followed, I could almost feel the weight of their shame travel through the walls of that house and reach me, though I was miles away. Because word has a way of moving quickly when pride begins to crumble. I heard through whispers that she no longer walked with her head held high, that her voice, which once carried nothing but sharpness, now carried panic, and that my son moved about like a man who had lost his footing, trying to find steadiness in a home that was no longer his to claim. It was not revenge that warmed me. It was not bitterness. It was simply the quiet knowledge that dignity has a way of shining even after others have tried to bury it. And in their downfall, I found not joy but a deep peace that told me I had been right to trust my instincts all those years ago. I sat in my little room one evening, the sun setting through the thin curtains, painting the walls with a gentle glow, and I realized that for the first time in so long I felt truly at ease. There was no tension in the air, no eyes rolling at my every move, no silence heavy with rejection, only the sound of my own breathing, and the comfort of knowing I had survived something that was meant to break me. My heart still carried scars, because betrayal from your own blood is not something that fades quickly, but those scars began to feel less like wounds and more like reminders of strength. I thought about the future, about the child they were expecting, and I wondered what kind of lesson would be passed down when the truth of that house could not be hidden forever. Because children grow up, and they learn. And sooner or later, they ask questions that reveal everything. Perhaps then my son would remember the mother who gave everything for him. Perhaps then he would understand that silence is not weakness, it is patience, waiting for the right moment to speak. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered to myself that life has a way of correcting itself. And though I had been cast out, I had not been erased, for the very roof over their heads carried my name long before they tried to strip me of my worth. In the end, I learned that betrayal from those closest to you does not mean the end of your story. It only means the beginning of a new chapter, where you choose dignity over despair and silence over shouting, because silence in its own time carries more power than cruelty ever could. They thought they had thrown me away, but instead they threw themselves into a lesson they could not escape. And I walked forward with peace, holding nothing but the strength I had built from a lifetime of sacrifice. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of my story. It warms my heart to know you listened. Please remember to subscribe so you can join me again for the next one.